Hi everyone, and welcome to Techweek TV, brought to you by Callaghan Innovation. We're so excited to have you joining us this morning. In this session, we're going to be interviewing Aaron McDonald, who is the CEO of Centrality, and he's going to be taking us on a blockchain journey, so it's bound to be interesting. So we're going to look at how blockchain works and how it's breaking the mold. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm great. So, for those viewers at home that have no idea what blockchain is, what's your sentence on that?
Yeah, it's the kind of the number one question I get asked. I think probably the simplest way to describe it is imagine a spreadsheet that anyone in the world can get access to. And anyone in the world can write, as long as they follow the rules, they can write to that spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet keeps a ledger of information about something. So take Bitcoin as an example, something that everybody knows about. There's a giant spreadsheet that's run on multiple computers around the world. There's a process that everyone gets to write to that spreadsheet that's fair, and there's an economic incentive that makes sure nobody breaks the rules.
So I guess am I correct in thinking that the first use case of blockchain was with cryptocurrency?
Yes.
And is cryptocurrency just like fake money that exists in the magical universe?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, I think. What is fake money and what is real money? You could argue that Bitcoin is realer money than the money sitting in your bank account, because that's literally fake money. You know, banks get issued a certain amount of money, but most of the money that sits in people's accounts isn't actually real. It's not backed by anything at all. And so Bitcoin is an actual thing, and you can inspect that at any time and see how many Bitcoins there are, and we know the monetary policy of Bitcoin network, and we can predict what it's going to do in the future. So some people might call it a better form of money than the money that sits in your bank.
I just realised that I've potentially opened myself up for a fractional banking debate.
Yes, you have.
Yeah, so let's not do that. Let's focus on the mission. The main thing that I wanted to get out of that is that blockchain is the technology that powers things like cryptocurrency to exist.
Totally, right? Yeah, and there's lots of other different kinds of use cases. The first one was cryptocurrency, and it's a very important one. Because that sets the scene for the economic rewards system for any other distributed or kind of decentralized technology or computing network. And I think you can think of blockchains more generally like open source cloud infrastructure. You know, we have open source software, which everybody's familiar with. Open source commons for infrastructure, which aren't owned or controlled by a single corporation or company.
So before we kick into questions, can you talk a little bit around why decentralization is so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general terms, we're in a position now in the world where probably, there are half a dozen large technology companies who control a lot of the technology ecosystem, and essentially every other entrepreneur pays those companies a tax. And the power that those companies have is enormous, and a lot of people don't realize how big how much power they have. And what most of that power comes down to is two things. One, a lot of our apps run on their infrastructure, and two, they own a lot of our data. If we imagine the digital world being a very data-driven world, and data almost becomes money, right? Certainly is for Facebook. And we think that world keeps going and becomes more and more digital. Do we want our applications and our digital selves to be essentially owned by corporations? I don't, and I think it's not a good world that we would live in the future if that was the case to continue. What blockchains are allowing us to do is to provide the same kinds of experiences that we get from these companies, but a little bit more on our own terms.
Awesome. And just so that I can we're doing a bit of an overview, you didn't do what most startups do, which is like go to a traditional VC or bootstrapped. You did an ICO. So what's an ICO?
Well, to be clear, we bootstrapped.
Yep.
So I lived for a year or so off my credit card and mortgage and ramen, just like most entrepreneurs did. And we actually got some investment from local New Zealand investment community, although maybe not the traditional investment community, around $5 million in our seed round. Yep. But when we proved that we had something interesting, we decided to go down this alternate funding path to scale up the business. We raised around $100 million in that process through what is commonly known as an ICO.
And can you just describe like what an ICO is? Because it's becoming increasingly popular as a way of raising money.
Yeah, well, it's kind of gone through some cycles, but essentially think of it like crowdfunding, but globally scaled, you know, and the processes in which people make, you know, contribute funds to those projects is done decentralized. So they're using typically a cryptocurrency to make the initial contribution. It's managed by what's called a smart contract, so it's kind of open. Everyone can see what they're getting, you know, in exchange for that contribution, and then those people essentially become stakeholders in the technology that you're building. So really different and interesting model, and it allows, I think, it's got some risks, obviously, with all early stage investments do. But at the same time, it opens up a whole world of possibilities in terms of how we can be more transparent with the way investments work, how we can be more global with the way capital is, you know, introduced into projects. It's very hard to get that kind of capital in New Zealand's market, for example. And even the asset classes that sit under them, they can be much more efficient representations of ownership in a company than, say, traditional stocks.
Awesome, I think that's a great overview. And what does Centrality do?
Yeah, so we've got kind of two big parts to the business. So we build technology, and we're focused on building the protocols and tools that allow developers to build these new kinds of decentralized apps without having to figure out all the hard stuff. And we're very strongly focused on user experience. So if you've used a blockchain application, you'll probably know that it's pretty shit experience, and it's not the kind of experience that scales for mass adoption. So our team's been really focused on creating new tools and new software to overcome some of those usability issues. We embed those in our network, so we built a decentralized computing network, a blockchain network, to run these types of applications, and then we invest in companies that are building cool applications in that space, and we have around 30 companies in our portfolio across the world who are building things across all sorts of areas of technology.
That's quite a lot, 30.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so, you know, there's been so much hype around crypto and blockchain and AI and all of these topics, and sometimes it's quite hard to kind of figure out what's real and what's just hype. I mean, I lived in San Francisco for 5 years, and so when blockchain and crypto, it was like riding the sort of unicorn wave all over again. Super interesting. So can we talk about some real world use cases and how blockchain has already been applied for good?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious one is Bitcoin. You have to kind of say that that's an interesting use case in its own right. And I think the best way to look at that is a better kind of gold. We use gold as a store of value primarily. You know, if you look at the intrinsic value of gold, you know, all the jewelry we wear and all that kind of stuff added up around the world, it's probably worth $100 to $200 billion. Well, gold is actually valued at $8 trillion. So people are using it as a way to store value. And in a digital world, you know, lugging chunks of metal around to store value probably isn't the way we're going to be in the future. So Bitcoin as a use case for a store of value is a strong one. And I think it will become the digital store of value in the future. Beyond that, the interesting things we're starting to see happen are in areas like supply chain. So how can a bunch of different businesses who have siloed systems communicate a process that they can all see what's going on at the same time? Typically, if you look at, you know, the normal setups, you have isolated databases that contain information about a process that is hidden from participants in that process. And there's a whole bunch of reconciliation and integration that has to happen to get that data transparency happening. So supply chains, I think, is a really useful use case that's starting to get some good traction. One of our ventures, Trackback, is doing some cool stuff in this, and we shipped some honey across to China recently on a live kind of environment where New Zealand Manuka honey could be traced all the way through to its customer in China, and we could prove the authenticity of that, and everyone could see what's happened along that journey.
And that's super important because Manuka grades are like the thing in honey.
Yeah, I think there's like 3 or 4 times as much honey sold in China as Manuka honey than we produce as a country. So that's one useful use case. I think the other one that is interesting for me is in communications and social networking. We've got a application in our portfolio called Silo, and really what it's doing is taking all the things that you do in Messenger or WhatsApp or WeChat and giving you those same capabilities in a way that's totally private, that a company is in control of the data, that the individual is in control of the data, that allows for open innovation so that application developers can build at will on top of this protocol. And I think that in itself is going to be a really interesting one. How can consumers take control of their social media in the digital space, and how can they take control of their identity in the digital space?
It takes me back to that. I don't want to talk about politics, but it takes me back to that deposition where Zuckerberg had to educate the Senate or whoever it was about what encryption is. It's no, I can't see messages. It's like, do you want to listen on the internet? It's kind of totally reminds me of that.
Well, you have to be careful with that because most people using Facebook Messenger don't turn on end-to-end encryption, and Facebook certainly can see those messages.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing about that point in particular is we have to trust that is true. Zuckerberg says this is the case, and Congress says, okay, cool. The people who don't understand what encryption is, believe that that's true. But actually, time and time again, they break that trust. And so, Zuck says things over and over again that prove not to be accurate, or he changes his mind. And the beauty of this space is it's all in the open. So people, if I say this is secure and end-to-end and we can't see what's going on and the infrastructure is decentralized, people don't have to believe me. They can just go look for themselves.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've got a bunch of questions to get through, so I'm just going to fire away.
Go.
How is blockchain set to change the world in the next 5 to 10 years and in 2050?
Yeah, well, I hope that we're at a point where people start to understand the value of their digital presence, and we start to see consumers wanting to take control of their digital identity and the digital footprint they leave in the world. And this is a great technology for enabling that. I think that's something that's going to be picking up steam in the next few years. If you look kind of forward further in the future, I imagine the world will be driven by 3 kind of core technologies. You've got AI driving the experience. How do we perceive an application? What's the data that's driving things like, speech recognition or face recognition, all those kinds of things. So kind of the experience layer driven by AI. I think you've got the financial layer driven by decentralized ledgers. It doesn't make sense not to have digitally native money. It's just stupid. So I think the world's money rails will run on this technology. You've got to think about a future where maybe today most of the financial transactions we make are humans to humans, right? In the future, 2050, most of the transactions will be machines to machines or machines to AIs or kind of non-human interactions, and our financial system can't deal with that. Every time you add another database like we have today with these different silos, there's exponential problems with the number of transactions and reconciliations that have to happen. So we have this world that's running on financial rails powered by this technology. And if we do things right, all sorts of assets will exist in that space. It'll be the way that we account for our property, the way that we account for ownership in a company, the way that we transact with each other around information will be all driven by that type of technology.
In my brain, I don't think I've thought about it like this before, but it's, how we're so human.
Yeah.
Yet we think about the online world as fragments, whereas I kind of feel like we should be 50% each in a way. And so we should have Bitmojis.
Yes.
It's almost like we're a little human avatar running around on the internet.
That's right.
Facilitating.
And people need to imagine that that's actually what's happening.
Yeah.
There is a digital you out there, and that digital you is owned by a company today. That's just ridiculous. And in the future, that digital you will become more and more important. If you haven't seen Ready Player One, which I assume you have, it's a good view into what a more digital future could look like, where a big portion of who we are exists in this space.
Giving people lots of homework today. It's quite funny. Okay, we've got 5 minutes and like 7 questions. So give me 3 industries that this is going to disrupt fundamentally.
Yeah, I think money, definitely. It's going to disrupt that. Supply chains is definitely going to disrupt that. And hopefully we disrupt the social media space.
What do you think needs to happen for it to be widely adopted technology?
The most important thing is to focus more on user experience. I think overcoming some of those awkward parts of onboarding and using this technology and understanding what it means is a really key thing. That's been a core focus of my team. The second thing I think is just my biggest enemy is apathy. We're like frogs in a frying pan that are being slowly warmed up, and we don't realize what the impact of someone else being in control of that data and digital presence will look like in the future. And so we need to wake up a little bit, I think, as a society. And I think that's starting to happen, but more needs to happen.
Totally. How is it contributing to economic sustainability and inclusion?
Yeah, this is a great question. We think that this is actually key, because if you have open systems and open money, then some of the types of behaviour that happens today can start to disappear. And there's some great projects that are working in this space. You take sex workers, which are a marginalised community in many countries. Even where it's legal to do that kind of stuff, they can't access payment systems because of the policies of those companies. They've got nothing to do with law.
Can't pay tax.
That kind of stuff. So how can we create open systems that include marginalised communities? And I think in the developing world, the cost of compliance in the current systems is huge, and often that cost is much higher than the revenue that you would get from customers in those markets. And so how can we make compliance cheaper? How can we build compliance into money itself rather than being on top of money? That's the kind of thing you can do with these programmable money systems.
I want to know what blockchain procurement looks like.
Yeah, that'd be a very interesting topic.
Totally. What advice do you have for businesses wanting to make use of blockchain technology?
Yeah, I think first just kind of start to understand it. Maybe if you don't know much about it, go and see Banking on Bitcoin on Netflix, another bit of homework there. If you're a little bit more technical, read the Bitcoin white paper and have a good look through that as a good starting point. If you're kind of looking for the next step, I think it's important to understand, to do what you would do with any product development, really understand what the customer pain points are or the business pain points. Start there, don't start with a solution. And if that solution leads to a point where you've got processes spread across multiple databases, we've got multiple counterparties that are trying to collaborate on a particular outcome or process, then maybe there's a good use for the technology.
What are the security vulnerabilities of using blockchain, and how can businesses plan ahead to mitigate them?
Yeah, I think there's 2 areas to look at with security. There's the network security. So you think of Bitcoin as a network, as a protocol, has never been hacked. 10 years it's been running, it's never been down. It's probably the world's most resilient computing infrastructure. But then there's safety, which is how users interact with that technology. And there's lots of instances of people being hacked and money stolen and all those kinds of things. So as a business, you need to think about how can you choose networks that are robust and have proven to be resilient and secure at the protocol level. Probably the ones that have been around longer, and proved that are the ones to look at first. So Bitcoin and Ethereum to start off with, and hopefully we'll be up there one day with our network. And then the second point is think about how your users interact with that technology. And just like it used to be really easy in the early days of the internet to steal people's information and passwords and all that kind of stuff, and over time we've introduced technologies that make the user experience better, that make security better. That same sort of stuff still has to happen in this space.
The last thing, there's 2 more things I want to ask you. There was a bit of and I don't know if this is a fallacy or not, so you can educate me. There was, how people were mining Bitcoin, and then the greenies were like, this is an environmental crisis. Can you explain that situation and then give me your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in reality, there's a lot of hype in that. The actual energy usage for Bitcoin is a fraction of, say, mining gold, and they use essentially for the same purpose. So you could say it's more eco-friendly than gold, and no one really complains about gold at the type of kind of hysteria that we hear about Bitcoin. It's more obvious because you can actually model the electricity transparency. But to be fair, there are some issues with it, and I think even though a lot of the electricity is produced from renewable resources, it's a question we have to keep asking ourselves: is it worth it? Thankfully, there are new technologies coming along that don't require huge amounts of electricity. Our network, for example, uses proof of stake, which means that you can run it on any old computer, maybe even your mobile phone, and it doesn't use up lots and lots of electricity, just like a normal app running. So I think, it's a question we need to keep asking ourselves. The hype's probably not real, but hopefully in the future we have more efficient ways to do that, and there's certainly some that are coming along that are very interesting.
Awesome. And the last thing I have for you is just for everyday New Zealanders that are a little bit eye roll when it comes to blockchain and crypto. At what point, because most people won't interact with it until they do, and when they do, it might be like quite far along. At what point do you think like the general public will actually be interacting with blockchain and crypto every day? Yeah,
we kind of have a philosophy that when we've done our job, people don't even know that it exists. You don't go to Netflix and download that from the App Store and wonder, is this running on a custom version of AWS, that's been specifically scoped for video streaming? It has, but that's not important.
It's a good example.
And so blockchain's just infrastructure, and it's my team's job to make that disappear. And I think Silo's coming out soon. I'd encourage everyone to give that a go. You won't even notice that there's a blockchain involved.
Awesome. That's all we have time for. Thanks so much for joining us today. And for you guys at home, what I want you to do is to go think about your digital human running around the internet and see what you see and do some visualizations. Thanks so much for tuning in to Techweek TV. Have an amazing day, and we'll see you later.